So a very good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome. I am Professor Leila Shukroon. I'm the Director of the Center for Global Justice and Rights and the theme lead of the Blue Governance Center on the questions of human rights and labor. Today, we are going to be in conversation with two great experts, Dr. Bonnie Ling, the Executive Director of Work Better Innovations. Bonnie needs no introduction. She's a frequent contributor to our seminars. She came several times in our Research Futures seminars, for those of you who have followed these seminars. She was also a guest in one of my podcasts, Our Rights in Action, dealing with women in the blue economy, together with Dr. Sophie Quentin, who's in the audience today. Dr. Ling is a practitioner and a researcher working to contribute to positive social impact internationally and locally with a background in international human rights and development. She has worked as an analyst, as a consultant for international businesses, driving change for corporate responsibility. Her professional background includes international public service with the UN in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Cyprus, in Liberia, but also civil society. She co-founded the Taiwan Project for Business and Human Rights in 2023 and is a university lecturer on responsible business. In 2024, she received the International Fletcher Women's Leadership Award for work with the private sector to bring about decent work and economic growth. Fletcher School was your alma mater, if I'm not mistaken, Bonnie. So Bonnie is absolutely brilliant, and she has this great quality of being able to explain complicated and sensitive things in a simple way. Equally brilliant, we're delighted to welcome Nora Bogerman, who's Outreach and Engagement Manager at Focus on Labor Exploitation Flex. Nora has joined Flex in March 24 as Outreach and Engagement Manager. She's leading the pilot study on worker-driven social responsibility, a highly collaborative project in the UK fishing industry. She works on supply chain due diligence, and prior to joining Flex, she has worked with 2050 and later independently as a researcher, a consultant, and facilitator to support companies strengthen their human rights practices and moving from policy commitments to action. She has engaged with many around the world, obviously many from civil society, and she has also discussed a lot with companies working, as I said, on their supply chains and questions of forced labor and human trafficking. So I think, as you understood from the title of this seminar, today we are going to discuss the question of labor exploitation in the blue economy. So the blue economy is something rather particular. It covers the economy related to water, to put it simply, oceans, but also fresh waters. So we're talking about the seas, but we're also talking about rivers and other sources of water like lakes around the world. So as to labor exploitation, you see, I was going a bit too fast. Labor exploitation, and we're going to define the term together with Bonnie and Nora, but you have to know, if I use a maybe more conservative or more traditional term, forced labor is what? Is a severe violation of human rights, affecting, according to the ILO, nothing less than 28 million of men, women, and children around the world. It's rooted in poverty, discrimination, the lack of social protection, and much more. 63%, again, according to the ILO, of forced labor happens in the private economy. The Forced Labor Convention, the famous Convention 29, adopted as early as 1930, contains the definition of forced labor and provides that it should be punished as a crime. Most of the ILO countries have ratified this convention, and yet a number have not, 6 in particular: Afghanistan, Tonga, Palau, Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, and interestingly, and I'm afraid this is something which is well known, the United States has not. There are terms that you are somehow familiar with, contemporary forms of slavery, that's my term, but generally the term which is used and I personally dislike is modern slavery, and of course human trafficking. So sometimes we say that, modern slavery encompasses forms of forced labor and human trafficking. according to the latest global estimates, we think that there would be 50 million people living in modern slavery in 2021. Of these people, 28 million were in forced labor. So you see, we sort of mix the two. 22 were trapped in forced marriages, for instance. And unfortunately, this is something to really bear in mind. The number of people in so-called modern slavery has risen significantly in the last 5 years for many reasons, from COVID to the degradation of the economic and geopolitical situations. In 2021, 10 million more people were in modern slavery compared to 2016 global estimates. So we say that many times in our seminars. Modern slavery is not something of the past, and this is something extremely complicated to deal with at sea, or as far as, sources of fresh waters are concerned, particularly at sea, obviously, because sea is sometimes seen, although it's not the case, as an environment of lawlessness or limited liability and accountability. This is something we are going to discuss with our two guests. So today we are going to try to research, to understand and discuss these complicated questions, very highly sensitive questions, which pose a series of ethical issues for the researchers and the practitioners alike. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Bonnie first, and of course Nora, as it's a conversation. And my first question is going to be extremely simple. What is labor exploitation? How would you define that from your own perspective? Do you stick to the ILO, or do you see labor exploitation slightly differently? And then why is it so particular to look at labor exploitation at sea?
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I am absolutely thrilled to be here. And thank you very much for the way over generous words, Leila. I think we have done a bunch of these seminars together, and the thing that I like the most about it is the dynamic discussion afterwards, where we're all learning and we can tease out some of these complexities. You know, what you just went through in your introduction, we can do a separate, I think, 5 webinars on that. Issues of definition and the history, tracing that definition, how things are defined, what we're forgetting, how do we measure things, what are the things we see, what are the things we don't see, right? Because they're not the same. And especially when we're working in the maritime sector, there's a lot that we don't see, right? Out of sight, out of mind. So with that in mind, let me just say that I think we have to start with the international definitions, because at least that gives us the ruler. So we're all aligned on terminology. The problem that you identified, and I suspect why you don't like the term modern slavery, is simply it has no definition in international treaty law, right? It's a term that we use as a shorthand, but it's not defined. So we get into like a knot over what is it? We don't know. So now modern slavery is kind of, we denote it as forced labor plus forced marriages. And that's how we come up with the global estimate for the number of people believed to be in modern slavery. But then you also raise the question, well, what is human trafficking, right? What is forced labor? So I think we have to go back. Maybe it's a bit boring to everyone else but lawyers, but we have to go back to the treaty law to look at how things are defined. So I did prepare some slides, and I was wondering, I'll go through them.
Yeah, very much so. I think you're absolutely right, because some of us are not lawyers, and even if you're a lawyer, you're not specialized necessarily in human trafficking or forced labor. And these terms, the way they are used in today's sort of, media and sometimes sensationalist discussions is very confusing. So I'm very glad we go back to the basic and we look at the law.
Okay. Perfect. So I'll try to be brief because I'm very curious also to hear from Nora and the work that her organization is doing to combat this. So let me just start with labor exploitation at sea. And here we have this first reference to slavery, right? Modern slavery in this BBC article, which came out. in August. And we see these stories more and more now, right? So that is perhaps the silver lining, that I see this growing public awareness for labor abuses in the maritime sector. This is good. It's good that we know where the problems are. And this came out, workers treated like slaves on Scottish fishing boats. It's good because we tend to, interact with the maritime economy in superficial, in surface ways, So here are some photos I took of seafood, sushi, as is presented to most individuals, either in the supermarket or in the restaurant. So that's fishers. That's what fishers do to bring seafood to our table. The middle photo is a photo I took as I was running to catch the last ferry back home, back to the Isle of Wight. And I was struck by how little you can see of the seafarers, right? They're tiny. And this is not even the biggest ferry, right, that we know. So I think I like these photos to kind of contrast this image of our limited interaction with the maritime economy. Now, what the stories have done now is to bring this other, undercurrent to the fore, which is, stories of massive exploitation being sold to the sea, human trafficking in Thailand, as this EJF report denotes. And the bottom photo is, a powerful survivor's account of his journey. So the author is Banuk Anamprum. He was a Cambodia fisher. And when he was waiting for the birth of his first child, he decided to, find additional income. So he ended up working on a fishing boat, and he did not see his family again for 4 years. So, on the fishing boat, he overworked, excessive overtime, and finally he took the chance to escape when the boat was docked at a port in Malaysia. So he swam to sea. But then, instead of being rescued, he was sold to a rubber, palm oil plantation. And then he had to, provide his labor under atrocious circumstances. And eventually he finally made it home with the assistance of civil society organizations. So he finally made it home. When he finally made it home, the child for whom he left, on this journey did not recognize him, did not know who he was. So the book is called The Dead Eye and the Deep Blue Sea. So for anyone who is interested to hear more, the survivor's own account of what they have experienced, I would urge you to look up this book and read his powerful account. Now, I am in Japan at a meeting, and I had the chance to speak to Lailani Tortino Rahan, who is the country manager for the mission to seafarers in the Philippines. So I asked her on the labor exploitation among seafarers. So we covered the fishers. So she spoke to me about the labor exploitation among seafarers still being prevalent, but it was especially the problem during the pandemic. The contracts were overdue, they were not renewed during the pandemic, and seafarers had no choice but to stay on the vessels, leading to a problem that we call abandonment. And they, can you imagine being isolated on a boat, worrying about your family, long hours, sometimes 16 to 18 hours. The long hours could be due to business pressures or being understaffed, or simply because the boat is so old that it takes so much extra labor to maintain. So she goes on, she told me about the long hours, the sense of isolation, and how seafarers had limited support for their health, including mental health. And also she mentioned spiritual health. Lack of access to nutritious food and diet, and sleep deprivation, being overworked, and then loneliness, simply loneliness. So it was a very powerful account. And we also discussed the discrepancy between the treatment for seafarers and fishers. So when we look at the blue economy, we're looking at two different groups of people working in blue economy, subject to different rules and different oversights. And we see that difference propagated in the type of labor violations that they experience and their access to remedy for the wrongs committed against them. Now, we've talked about the definition of forced labor. And it basically, the definition of forced labor, according to international treaty law, is it has two components: work that is performed under a menace of penalty, and that is offered involuntarily. This is really important because I think in popular media, we tend to think of forced labor as people in chains, right? High fences. Here we have a graphic that was produced by the International Labor Organization, where you have this person in chains in a cage, and this is not consistent, completely consistent with what we see. We see other subtle means, things like debt, meaning that a person's not offering his or her labor voluntarily through debt bondage, through coercion, through fraud, or simply due to a sense of fear of being denounced to immigration authorities. You can imagine if you're in a country working illegally, you will fear that, being denounced to immigration authorities. The testimony that we quickly spoke about highlighted things like abusive working and living conditions and excessive overtime, which are indicators of forced labor. So when we do forced labor assessments, we look for these indicators. They're like clues to inform us of a very, very bad labor situation. So bad that organizations like NORA's Flex, they're trying to change systematically as an issue of power asymmetry in the employment relationship. Let's quickly talk about why this is so difficult to address for the maritime economy. And I think one we talked about already, it's far, right? Out of sight, out of mind. It's far away from the land and far away from the port. We don't see it. And I think another thing I want to raise is that this sector is so confusing jurisdictionally, right? We're looking at overlapping jurisdictions that is really confusing. And we're only talking here about public law. So things like coastal state, the port state, the state where the ship is flagged. So this is only the public aspects. We're not even talking about how the ship is owned. And then the other thing is maritime economy. Things like shipping has tended to be underemphasized. So when we're looking only at supply chains, we're not looking at the things, logistics that bring the goods to the consumer. Let's also throw it into the mix. Things that you highlighted with her and Pierre in the paper. Why do we not address this as effectively as we should? Is this reason that policies to date have tended to focus on economic return, and then maybe the ecological importance of preservation of marine resources, but they have generally said little about the social role of oceans. And I would really like you to discuss some of the recommendations that you come up in your paper on how we can do to fix the problem. What can we do? Well, one avenue has got to be a legal remedy, right? You take it to the court. And here we have a story of lawyers who are helping victims of forced labor bring a human rights claim against the Home Office. This is certainly one option. But this is at the end, right? This is after a problem has occurred. I think what is more, important right now when we think about it as a structural issue is how can we fix the system so we don't even get to the problem, right? The best way to fix a wrong is to prevent it so that it doesn't happen again. So Nora will address it. I want to quickly talk here to say that we need to be not afraid to embrace the complexity of all the issues at hand. We need to move away from this depiction of this menacing, this menace. So here we have this indicator, which is isolation, feeling of loneliness. But isolation can be more than being plucked away and be put in the middle of nowhere. It could be also a sense of linguistic isolation, right? It could be the sense of not being able to reach your family. You can be in a crowded party and still feel lonely, that type of analogy. And I think we need to be aware of all the various issues around this subtle sense of coercion, things that cannot be seen, not chains, but just as effective. And we need to be ready to learn from other sectors. We're looking at the maritime economy. Right here, it's estimated, it's a high-risk sector. It's estimated to be about 3 million of revenue. But if we look at electronics and clothing, also as high-risk sectors, but a lot more value. How can we learn from things that we have tried in electronics and clothing that we can maybe import to fishing with the aim of changing the structure that leads to risks of exploitation? So my short conclusions are, needs to be lawful, of course. They cannot be vacuums for labor rights and human rights anywhere. We need to be proactive, go above the law. Sometimes the law is not enough. And we need to be ready to, embrace the complexities, because this is complex, right? And with that in mind, let me just say, please write me if you have any questions. And let me just quickly turn the floor over back to you and Nora.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. That was brilliant. As often, if not usual, you have explained things very, very clearly. We had great reactions in the chat. I'm just going to read one from Sunil. Sunil says, hello, everyone. Greetings. Given that 90% of goods, both raw material and finished products, are transported by sea, actually, given contemporary maritime slavery is rampant, some estimates talked about 50 million indeed. Almost everything we touch is probably touched by slaves in its life cycle, and this is a sobering thought. It is indeed, because all the goods you refer to, sushi is what we eat, but all the goods we touch, all the things we live with, if we take this sort of broad definition of slavery, which is sometimes confusing, but at least refer to forced labor, very much so, it is in our daily lives, very much so. And that's something I think quite striking and disturbing, and for people to know, to fight against, and to obviously understand before that. There's something which really struck me in your presentation. I think we could maybe discuss that briefly before I give the floor to Nora. This sort of transfer of exploitation, what I would call transfer of exploitation. In the story you mentioned, this worker has been transferred, if I'm not mistaken, from the sea to the land, and yet still very much exploited before he was allowed to go back to his family and see his child, right? So this is something we see probably because there's a lot of organization in forced labor and slavery. There are gangs, there are criminal gangs. So the transfer from the sea to the land, so sort of, geographies, but also from one sector to the other. You're absolutely right to mention that in textile industry, in food industry, there's also a lot of exploitation. And some of you might have seen recently, it's coming into the news quite a lot, the stories of cryptocurrencies or high-tech workers from sometimes China, who are very much exploited in South Asia to scam people or force them to get some crypto, things like that. So what do you think, Bonnie, about that, this sort of movement and yeah, of sectors, people, geographies?
Oh gosh, thank you for raising it, because I cut that part out of my presentation because I thought I can't pack too much in. So I get to address it. So of course we need to look at transnational organized crime. If we look at the international treaty that addresses the trafficking in humans, the movement and the, of people with the aim to exploit them, it comes actually under the umbrella of transnational organized crime, So we're just teasing out all these threats of complexity, but I think the underlying questions are still the same. Why does it still persist? I mean, we know about the problem of forced labor. The Forced Labor Convention is almost 100 years old, right? The Human Trafficking Protocol is 2 decades old. And yet the problem still persists. We're dealing with it in different forms, but it's still here. And I think we're at the point now where I'm always grappling. I love listening to Nora because she offers kind of like a potential solution,
Very much
But
so.
yeah, the short answer is I don't know, but I hear the frustration. I love Sunil's comment, which is sobering, and I really applaud us as consumers taking ownership of the problem as well. We are implicitly involved.
Yes, very much so. So that's maybe something we can keep in our minds for a later discussion. Something some of us have discussed for decades, I'm afraid, people working on businesses and human rights and CSR, what's the responsibility and the ability of consumers to change things, knowing that very often we have no information, about what's going on the product, I mean to say. But let's keep that in mind. Bernie, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for being so clear. I'd like to give the floor to Nora. So Nora, shall we start with the exact same question from your perspective, from the perspective of your organization, and maybe that's a good opportunity to present Flex. How would you define labor exploitation?
Yeah, thanks, Leila. Thanks for your intros and having me today, and Bonnie for laying the foundation so nicely. If you couldn't speak about these things as nice, it's obviously shocking. I want to flag before I really start out describing, kind of presenting Flex and what we do, and then going on to talk about our project in UK fishing at the moment. Just to flag that I will be joined in a moment by Chris Williams from International Transport Workers Federation, who's a close partner in our worker-driven social responsibility project, the pilot I'll be talking about. And he is here today with a very limited time to really bring a lot more on-the-ground experience from his year-long experience in the UK and worldwide, really. But he will be talking about his casework and some kind of stories and experience from the UK. So he will be joining shortly. And when he's here, I think that's fine. Starting with that is actually perfect. And then I would just talk about the project more broadly when he's left again. So just in terms of our structure. Leila, yes, big question. What is labor exploitation? What is forced labor, modern slavery? I think from absolutely in agreement what Bonnie with what Bonnie shared. From our point of view and kind of Flex's approach is really to see labor exploitation on a spectrum. So really to think about bad practices, including breaches of employment rights, on a spectrum between decent work, everything is fine, or it's good, it's in line with the law, up until extreme cases of exploitation, including modern slavery. There's really a spectrum of situations in employment that include bad practices, but that can basically, in the conditions the work is taking place, minor breaches of the law and minor breaches of employment rights can really compound and lead to more severe exploitation. So there's really a spectrum where a situation can easily move on from, minor labor abuses to more extreme cases, and the same factors and systemic problems and structural causes that make workers vulnerable to abuse, they can lead to more severe forms of exploitation as well. And then I think also, given the experience with different kinds of organization and companies, I would say the language that we're using to describe a problem also depends a lot on how do people in organization respond to them. So companies are obviously a lot more responsive when they hear modern slavery. and labor exploitation or poor practices wouldn't resonate with them so much. So I think what terms are we using is in practice also often kind of or which definitions we're using is often, I think, also what purpose of our communication, and what is the audience, and what appeals to different audiences in that case. But really, it's a spectrum on which abuse can happen. And there is Chris, which I cannot see Chris, but is he here now in the?
Oh, that's wonderful. Apparently, Chris has just joined, which is great. Very timely. Very warm welcome, Chris.
Yes, and maybe before I would include Chris and have him share from his work with fishers in the UK. Briefly to say, so Flex Focus on Labor Exploitation is a London-based human rights charity. It's a research and policy organization dedicated to ending labor exploitation, and really by challenging and transforming the systems and the structures I just talked about that make workers vulnerable to abuse. And obviously, we have a very strong focus on migrant workers. Flex has traditionally worked a lot in research and policy advocacy in sectors like agriculture, care, cleaning, gig economy. But we are now, since the beginning of the year, really involved in the fishing industry, and with our project really putting a focus, learning a lot, and uncovering a lot of similarities also to the work in other sectors the Flex team have been doing. And I myself am part of the kind of corporate accountability stream of our work, working with research and advocacy as well. And I'm coordinating the WSR pilot in fishing, and Chris from the International Transport Workers Federation is, as I said before, a really key partner in this project and in building a fair seafood pilot in UK fishing. And supporting and working together with my outreach team on the ground in Scotland to see how we can make it happen and how we can establish this pilot. And I will share more after Chris has left about the project. And as I've been speaking with Leila and the team before, our hope, Chris, from you joining today and being here was that you can obviously, based on your experience with fishermen, give a much more realistic and genuine insight into quite typical situations and journeys and stories that you've seen and heard from migrant fishermen coming into the UK, their experience of, bad conditions, including abuse. So yeah, if you wouldn't mind sharing a few of your insights, maybe quite typical things that you've seen or cases you've worked on, and how have you been able to support those people?
Are we just speaking about the UK?
You can speak about everything, Chris, and warm welcome. We've just started a few minutes ago. We set the floor. My colleague Bunny, Dr. Ling, just presented the questions of labor exploitation, modern slavery, human trafficking. We haven't yet spoken too much about, real life cases. So feel free to speak about the UK if you wish. I suppose that not many people really comprehend what's going on, including in the UK, and you as well, other global cases.
Sure. Okay. Well, I'll go from big to small then in relative terms. So fishing is obviously one of the oldest livelihoods and professions that exists around the world. Over time, employment within fishing was generally, and is still to a large extent around the world, very informal. So verbal contracts and agreements based on shared risk, shared endeavor, and shared reward. So what's tended to happen around the world is that people, usually recruited from family networks or coastal communities, go to work for vessel owners on the basis of a share of the catch. So they would say, I own a boat, will you work for me? I'll give you half, or I'll give you a quarter of the profits or of what we catch. And that can be arranged in millions of different ways. All around the world it's different. It can be different vessel for vessel. It can also be different for crew to crew. Like some people on an apprenticeship might get 2.5%, but then a deckhand might get 12%. or up to 20, and some people who just go to sea with one crew might give them 50% because they're going to spend a lot of their working life with this other person. They'd rather treat them fairly and basically therefore be able to have a good working relationship and be a bit selective about who they're working with. Over time, what has changed is the global fishing industry has got bigger, it's industrialized, certain segments have become much more profitable, much more capitalized, and the global fishing fleet has expanded all around the world's oceans. So it's no longer like a nearshore kind of activity. As that's happened, obviously your costs go up in terms of fuel because the vessels are further away from port for a longer period of time. You have to invest more in ice and other things and other infrastructure because you're trying to keep the products which are perishable fresh so that you can sell them. And in doing that, what's happened is that the fixed costs and capital investments have gone up and up and up. So have the fuel, bait, and ice costs. And as a result, vessel owners have sought to find another way to lower their costs and therefore increase their profits. Because as they get income from the fish that they catch, that's either gonna go on their profits or on wages. So what they've done is instead of spending a large proportion of the income on shares for the people on their boats, they've moved towards hiring contract workers. And we see that around the world. And the evolution has basically meant that now there is a split within the fishing industry. People that work, informally in fishing and coastal communities, people that work on the basis of a share in small scale fisheries or in large industrial fisheries, and then hundreds of thousands of migrant workers that are recruited through agencies, usually seafaring agencies, to be placed on distant water vessels. And the main 5 distant water fishing nations are China, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, and Spain, which between them account for around 95% of global distant water fishing effort. And they predominantly recruit now from Southeast Asia. So the largest number of migrant workers who are contracted and recruited through agencies to work in the fishing industry are Indonesian, but there's also a lot of Ukrainians, a lot of Filipinos, and a rapid expansion recently in some parts of the world, most notably Europe, to include countries like Ghana, Senegal, and Peru. There's a lot of fishers in Peru. And obviously, depending on where the vessel is flagged and where the owners are based and where the skipper is from, they might want crew that they can communicate with. So the Spanish fleet recruits quite a lot of Peruvians. What they don't tend to do is recruit an entire workforce from one place, because then they could get organized and they could go on strike if they're not happy with their terms and conditions. So you tend to see a kind of, let's see, a national or racial hierarchy within the vessels where they tend to recruit a split of different workers from different countries. And that's usually made up of some African, some Latin American, some Asian, but it depends where the vessels are and where they're picking up their crew. Having said all of that, that creates issues because the countries in which these workers are fishing are usually not countries that they have a work permit or visa for. So they end up having to live and work on the vessels. And that would be the same in Taiwan as it might be in Uruguay. Montevideo is a big port of convenience for the South Atlantic. But this also spills over into the national fleet. So in the United States, it happens all across Europe. So that's the French fleet, English, pre-Brexit, but it's still going on, Irish, Spanish, Portuguese, and they will recruit migrant workers in the same way. So some vessels in the national fleet will be there'll be a family business where they will employ a skipper, might be their nephew, and then they'll recruit 2 crew from where they live in Scotland or Wales. Other employers might have 4 crew that are all Filipinos or are all Ghanaian, for example. So what we've been focusing on the last few years in both Ireland and the UK is trying to shed light on this issue of labour exploitation when it comes to migrant workers, because they are coming into these countries without a work permit, which deprives them of rights in the country, makes them highly dependent on their employer, and means that they're actually working for far less than what a share would be and far less than what the minimum wage in that country would be, the country to which the vessel's flagged, in the case I'm talking about the UK. So our point is that it's discriminatory, and that the principle of equal pay for equal work should apply, and that this 2-tier system of having nationals and EU crew on a share or having workers from other parts of the world who are basically being paid, let's call it 1,000 or 1,500 euros a month, is unfair and is exploitative. So we've been working to deal with cases and take them to the authorities, because again, migrant workers don't tend to know who to contact. They don't tend to know who to trust. Their only means of complaining is usually to go to the skipper or the vessel owner, who are usually the cause of the problem, or their agency, who often is also the cause of the problem as well, in terms of like not paying them or not paying them on time or not paying them enough. And in the case of the skipper or the captain, denying them medical attention, physically or verbally abusing them, not paying them on time, not treating them with dignity and respect, unsafe working conditions, that kind of thing. So I've been dealing with cases in the UK and helping my former colleague who worked in Ireland for the last 4 years. And in that period of time, I've spoken to hundreds and hundreds of migrant workers, mainly from Ghana, Philippines, Sri Lanka, and India, which is where the UK recruit from. And in the case of Ireland, it's mainly Philippines, Indonesia, Ghana, and Egypt, just a historical quirk with how some undocumented workers from Egypt started arriving in Ireland under the Freedom of Movement Agreement in the EU. So yeah, and what do we get? We get people being denied medical attention quite frequently. We get people being injured at work and not paid the compensation they think they're due when they have life-changing injuries, like losing 1 or 2 fingers, which is very common in fishing. But going back to this share system, in the old days, if you went to sea with your uncle and you lost a finger, you wouldn't take him to court because he's your uncle. These days, these people are employees, but the fishing industry still thinks like, oh, you should just lose a finger at work and get on with it. But it obviously curtails their future employment prospects if their only skill set or their main source of income is fishing. Choosing the fisherman that's got 2 fingers missing versus the one with a whole hand, it's an obvious question around kind of productivity and what they can and can't do, especially if you have to process things on board, which happens in some of the larger vessels. So medical attention is one problem. Overwork and insufficient rest is another. The fact that when they are overworked, they're not being paid overtime. And then a huge one all over the world is this lack of social security, because they're migrant workers and they're brought on in transit effectively, so they don't exist in the country. Their employer doesn't make social security and pension contributions in the country in which they're working, because they're not working there, and they also don't make that payment back in the Philippines or in Indonesia. So if they get injured, or they can no longer work due to their age or another non-work related illness, there's nothing in the pot for them to live off. We often have very exploitative sort of conditions from the agents. There are often agents which are effectively extracting illegal fees from workers, or are debt bonding them and lending them the money to get a job and then taking all of their wages in return. And quite often we get stories where or cases where people have been working on board a vessel for a year and then they get back to the Philippines or Indonesia just to find out that a month into the contract their family stopped receiving the money. So non-payment of wages, or late payment of wages, or underpayment of wages, or promising a bonus that then never gets paid is also fairly common. Abandonment is considered by the International Maritime Organization as whenever you haven't been paid for 2 months or more. That's fairly frequent in these year-long or 2-year-long contracts. And yeah, so I mean, that's trying to give you guys a kind of, global view, and then, the most kind of, without talking about specifics of cases, those are the most frequent things that come up. But I mean, things that are harder to resolve are things around, threats or racism, that kind of thing, because there's basically no labor market enforcement in fishing. There are no inspectors that are going on the vessels, and by the time you have an allegation of racism or a threat, it ends up being worker versus skipper, and then it kind of disappears. So I mean, I don't know if there's anything within that you want me to talk about more, or whether that gives a sort of good.
That's pretty amazing, Chris. Thank you so much. It gave us, and I think many attendees, people in the audience, don't really, or didn't before you spoke, realize what's going on, because it's so shocking, and it's here at our door, really, in the UK, and of course everywhere in the world. But the very fact that it's so much in this country as well, for the reason you explained, is yes, as you said, shocking, appalling. There's something. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I'll share 2 links with Nora to a documentary made by the BBC, and there's a radio piece that I think would be really helpful as context for the kind of, and the BBC piece in particular is good because it centers on worker testimony for what's happened, and I think the audience would, if they're able to watch on iPlayer, I think that would be really beneficial. So I'll share that with Nora.
Please do
Yeah,
that.
we'll share that. I think Bonnie has also alluded to that in her introduction, and also Chris will make some reference to the ITF briefing about the transit visa loophole, and also Dr. Jess Sparks' research report, which is really the most comprehensive research out there that's really giving some, you know, again, shocking data and insights and stories based on her research of fishers in the UK. So we will provide all those links after the event.
Great. She's also now working on the cleaning of the data for the biggest ever global survey that was conducted with the help of Stella Maris and ITF, which got, I think, around 3,500 usable surveys from migrant fishers all around the world, which she's then splitting to look at different ports, regions, flags, countries of origin, agencies, which I'm hoping will be published in the next few months, which will be a fantastic piece of work building on the experience from running these surveys in the UK.
Mm-hmm. That's excellent. Thank you so much for that, Chris. So I'm sure, because I know you can't stay too long with us, so I'm sure we have questions from the audience, but I have one question for you, which I find, you know, very important and relates to something Bonnie was alluding to a bit earlier, the question of language, for instance. So divide and rule, you explained very clearly that one practice of these, you know, companies is to recruit fleet from people from many different countries and to ensure that you don't have many from the same nationality, precisely to divide them. So that's capitalism at its best. And so how do you deal with that, practically speaking, when you work with these fishers? How do you communicate with them? How do you try to engage and organize them?
We spend a lot of time translating the materials and resources. We spend a lot of time identifying multilingual kind of leaders within these different groups who can then translate it into, like the example, I work with a lot of Ghanaian workers. They can speak Fante, Twi, Ga, and they can basically translate within the groups, because it's not only a question of language, it's also a question of literacy. You know, you've got to remember that on the whole, people are working in fishing because they've sort of grown up in fishing, and it's a very particular skill set that is not the same skill set that you need as being an academic. So it's not uncommon to meet fishers that are not, you know, not particularly literate, let's say it like that, which is not a reflection on anything other than the fact it's not really a relevant skill when you're going fishing. So we work in lots of different languages. The ITF inspectors are from countries all around the world. Most of them speak multiple languages. We work with interpreters where needed. We recommend that the authorities that are investigating do that as well, because it's ridiculous boarding a vessel to conduct interviews where the only person you can communicate with is the skipper, which does happen. So yeah, translation apps, DeepL. I mean, there's lots of really useful modern technology and AI that you can use to break down some of those barriers. I mean, I was just dealing with a case last week with an Indonesian. I don't speak a word of Bahasa, but I've been able to communicate with him very effectively just using my mobile phone and using some of the translation apps. In terms of the divide and rule, you made the point really well. And it's not even just because of language. It's also because then they're all coming from different countries, different agencies, and they're on different contracts. So their pay and terms and conditions are different. So they're less likely to all look around and go, hang on a minute, why are you getting paid twice what I'm getting paid? You know, it's basically just a way of breaking solidarity between workers. And I think part of the organization work that we do in the various regions of the world that we operate is really about class consciousness and about the fact that a worker is a worker is a worker. If you are ratting out on the other workers to try and get the next contract with your employer, that is a problem. You're weakening your own prospects as a worker. And I think that that's something we focus on as well, because the only power comes from being united in that sense. And I mean, we saw a large-scale strike in the West African and Seychelles tuna fleet last year from mainly Senegalese and Ivorian workers. And I think those sort of things are only possible when you have a shared sense of like how bad and how unfair your treatment is. And a large part of that is also understanding how chronically underpaid these people are. I mean, the standards outside of the, you know, taking outside the national waters, because it's very different in each country, but internationally it's not uncommon to see $300 a month as the pay on a Chinese vessel, $550 on a Taiwanese, and then any amount between sort of $800 to $1,400. Let's take that for sort of as an average. But these are people that are working basically a 16-hour day round the clock, no days off for a year. So I mean, it's I mean, a tiny fraction of what the minimum wage would be. We estimate it's always, in a European context, going to be less than a third or a quarter of minimum wage. And then at the same time, the industry says, "Oh, we can't recruit good people in this country." And it's just, well, hang on, that's because you're paying them, £3 an hour. Of course you can't. It's unfair. It's a race to the bottom, as you were saying, in capitalism, and unfortunately, it also undermines a sustainable industry in the fishing nations, because they can't recruit, because the employers know that they can get away with paying. Why should they pay someone 50,000 on a share when they can pay someone 10,000 through an agency in Manila?
Obviously. So another question, and I don't know whether we have time for that now, but it comes to my mind, is obviously linking what you just said with the question of migration and the hypocrisy around it. That's surely something you work on. I saw in the chat, and I don't know whether you want to respond to that right now, but I saw in the chat a comment from a participant, Manohar, who shared his experience on a ship himself, saying that he was very isolated for a long time, and it led to depression, and nobody was coming to inspect the boat. And that would be really nice, actually, to have more inspections from international authorities, including ILO, or more necessarily specialized authorities. So would you like to respond to that?
Definitely.
Yeah, great.
It would be a great pleasure. So yeah, I read that comment. It's unfortunately not uncommon, issues around depression, suicide that stem from isolation, which is itself an indicator of forced labor. But in the distant water fishing fleet, and if you're a migrant worker that doesn't have immigration status and you have to live on a boat, you're isolated by default. So what I always say is, of the 11 forced labor indicators, 9 of them are present all the time in the industrial fishing fleet. So it's obvious that the preconditions are always there, and it's just a bit of a lottery which flag and which kind of employer you're working for. So in terms of inspections, the ITF has 140 maritime inspectors who are in all of the world's main shipping commercial ports, where we enforce our campaign against flags of convenience, which are used, you flag a vessel to Panama or Liberia so that you don't have to pay according to where your vessel is beneficially owned, which could be Norway or Greece or whatever. So we have ITF inspectors to internationally check that the standards are being applied, and we enter into ITF agreements with companies to make sure that their crew, regardless of what country they're from, are covered and are also that standard applies to them, and that includes their wages. That the ILO and the IMO able-bodied seamen basic wage and overtime is paid, along with paid leave and social security and everything that we were discussing. Within that group of 140 inspectors, 10% or 14 are trained to inspect fishing vessels and are trained to handle fishing vessel cases. The issue is that we don't have ITF agreements with global fishing companies at the moment. That's our main priority, because that's the only way to ensure decent work. We do work with the ILO, and last year I was training labour inspectors with one of our FOC coordinators in Peru and in Ecuador, because what you tend to find in fishing, like in the maritime sector, it's clear what sector it is. Fishing falls between multiple sectors. So you have the Ministry of Labour or the Ministry of Employment that never visit fishing vessels. You have the fishing authorities who go there to check whether the fish has been caught legally and the quotas have been stuck to, and the fishing gear is the correct one, but they're not looking at labor and they're not looking at immigration. Then you have the immigration authorities who are checking the paperwork and are basically trying to deport people and get rid of them in countries that have sort of right-wing governments that are hostile to migrants. So, and then you have the port authorities, and then you have the maritime safety bodies. So all of them are doing a slightly different job, but the reality is it's usually only immigration and maritime safety that visit a vessel, whereas the issues are usually employment rights related, or related to not having immigration status. So what we've been advocating for is that countries that want to implement decent work in fishing ratify the Work in Fishing Convention, which is ILO C188, and that they also resource and set up memorandums of understanding or agreement between the different government agencies that have a remit in fishing so that they can run joint inspections. Because there's no point going on board and checking that a vessel is seaworthy, but not checking that anybody on board actually has a legal contract. It needs to be done together.
Yeah, very much so. So the same division problem, which is unfortunately it's not, you know, a surprise, and something we see for those of us working on businesses and human rights a lot everywhere in all sectors. Chris, Nora, Bunny, if you still have a bit of time, we have a question. We have actually several questions in the chat, as you can see, probably. We have a question from Pam. Pam is a trade lawyer working with me. Thank you so much to all the panelists. And Chris, this is so disheartening. Do you think that the CSRD can somehow address some of these issues by making more organizations responsible through transparent reporting along supply chain? Yes, reporting. Again, those of us working on business and human rights, we've seen what reporting means, but I don't know, Bunny or Noah, would you like to answer this question? And then maybe I'll give the floor as well, if she wants to Francesca, because Francesca, you're working for the Institutes on Human Rights and Business. You have been working a lot on seafarers, maybe less on fisheries, but I'm sure you have a lot of things to say. And there's another question or remark from Sophie. Fascinating and worrying insight from all speakers. Thank you for putting a spotlight on these dark areas of the blue economy. Everything should be done, of course, to combat exploitative illegal practices, but given the vastness of the problem of the ocean and human nature, it's realistic to seek global solution can be found in the current international context. Yes, indeed, of blue acceleration in the use of the ocean against background of geopolitical instability. You have to know that Sophie is working on strategic and geopolitical questions. So the question. Right, so shall we start with the...
Leila, I was wondering whether or not we should give some remaining time to Nora to talk about some of the solution they're piloting up in Scotland, because they might answer some of the audience questions on what could be done. Should we do that?
Sure. So in terms of time, guys, so that I give everybody the floor according to the time we have. Nora and Chris, do you still have some time?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, that's great. So it's totally up to you, Nora, if you want to go back to the sort of solution driven answer, and then we can go back to the question which were asked in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, I feel this conversation and the questions that are coming up are worth, they probably need more than another 15 minutes of our time, and there's a lot more to discuss, and even to go deeper into, you know, that the worker experience and the realities that Chris started to share about. But I think I'm here today, and I'd be grateful to have some space to share about our project. I think it's really exciting, really innovative, and as we're speaking about really, really complex issues, and Bonnie mentioned it in her introduction, very, very complex situations with structural issues that involve many, many different actors. Our project is complex in itself to address and kind of meet the complexity of the problem. So I'd like to present on that a little bit, but it does actually go back to Pam's comment and question. I think I don't want to speak about the CSRD right now here. I'm happy to follow up in the conversation, but the WSR project that we're working on and the program we established does link in with buyer companies, corporate or supply chain due diligence and their human rights work in a way that it provides a more impactful and effective and actually work-oriented way, human-oriented way to conduct their human rights due diligence. So we can see almost our project in light of that question, Pam, to really suggest a solution, an approach, alternative to approaches that companies have been trying to address human rights issues in their supply chains in a not effective way. They haven't seen the impact, they haven't improved the lives of workers, especially deeper down in the supply chain. And fishing, the buying companies and the bigger companies covered by all those new legislative frameworks, they don't have the transparency and the control and the agency and the capacity to really improve the situation for workers. So I think our project is not the solution, but an approach, and we really view the Fair Seafood program that we're trying to build as a learning project. So we want to see whether worker-driven social responsibility, as it has been really successful in agriculture in the US, but also in other sectors around the world, can work, and how can it work in fishing in a very different context. And we're starting in Scotland. So really, as a quick overview of the model, something that we're aiming to build, and that's describing the logic of this program and how it should benefit workers. So you don't need to understand everything that's here on the slide. I will explain the basic ideas and how it's supposed to work. So the key thing to understand about WSR, worker-driven social responsibility, and it is different to other approaches, it is that it is a market-based approach. So it does involve commercial incentives for employers, in this case, the vessel owners, the skippers, and the buyers of the seafood in our case. It's market-based, but it is worker-driven and worker-centered. So at the center of the program that we're trying to build is a code of conduct that is really informed, by workers, by organizations like ITF, who are working with the workers, who understand what the problems are, what the issues are. So the code of conduct that is defined by the workers, this is how we understand good working conditions, is at the core of the program. And that is part of legally binding agreements that seafood buyers, so retailers in the UK, for example, they're entering into legally binding agreements with a worker organization. And in our case, again, ITF, in our pilot in Scotland, will step into that role. So WSR is market-based, it's worker-driven, legally binding. And the key thing also that differs from a traditional human rights due diligence approach is that the enforcement and the verification of the employment situation and the working conditions is done by an independent body. So it's not a private company, it's not buyer driven or some third-party audit scheme or certification. It's really an independent monitoring body that first of all assesses and verifies whether the worker code is met and employers really abide by it, but also they provide that space that's, as it stands currently, is missing, not only in fishing and other industries is the same, the place to really safely speak up. So for workers to report their grievances, to speak up when they have issues. And right now in the UK, again, back to the point Chris touched upon briefly, workers on a transit visa they don't have legal status in the UK, them speaking up about issues on board, they face the risk of facing immigration enforcement response rather than really help, for them to seek remedy. That risk is very high for them, and they fear, and also the fear of retaliation by their employers. So the WSR model and this independent monitoring body that is established will allow that safe space for workers to speak up about the realities. I'm just checking. Yeah, so I think, and then that commercial, just to wrap up on that market-based kind of element of WSR, if an employer is not complying to the worker code or is not making the right steps towards improving the situation, there is a sourcing, so in a commercial consequence inbuilt into the model that lead companies, by means of their legal contract with the worker organization, say if the working conditions don't improve as laid out in the code of conduct, the lead company must stop sourcing from those vessels, from those employers. So that's kind of the stick, more or less, in the model. Yes, I think this is, in a nutshell, the model that we're trying to build and that the WSR program kind of runs by. The last point only, also to emphasize again the difference to traditional approaches to supply chain due diligence. there is a role also for the lead company to not only expect of suppliers and of the supply chain to improve, but they also need to provide material, financial support to make the improvements possible for the employers. So there is more responsibility, as we're seeing that more and more on the, in the international arena, the buyer's responsibility to responsible purchasing and their practices, that also needs to be a part. So this is in a nutshell a model that we're trying to build. And as I said in the introduction, the outreach and engagement team of Flex, together with ITF, we're at the moment in a stage, I would say, of scoping and mapping and building relationships on the ground, understanding, the supply chains in the northeast of Scotland better, and really finding a feasible way to bring this program into existence, speaking to buying companies, to the producers there on the ground, and for my team, together with Chris, really learning and understanding more about the reality of workers on the ground. And hopefully in 6 months from now, or in the future, my team will also be able to bring more or shed more light on those experiences and the realities of those workers. And it's really hard. So I'm really grateful, Chris, for you to be here today and having shared those insights, because obviously due to the isolation and the nature of fishing and the nature of the reality of the workers, it's really hard for outsiders to really grasp what is going on the vessels. And hopefully this program will put that actually in the center of a solution, not the solution, but one of the streams, I think, that can give us some hope.
Yes, thank you so much, Nora. So it's indeed good to be, to some extent, solutions focused as well, because it's nice to denounce and talk about the reality, but at the same time we need to be concrete and try to find solutions if the states are not finding solutions to help these workers. That's pretty excellent. So I'd like to get back to the questions, knowing that we don't have that much time left and I don't want to keep you for too long, but anyone to talk about the reporting possibly, and whether this is something interesting, or would you like to move to another question or remark that you would like to formulate? We might have other questions in the audience as well.
I'll just take the reporting question quickly, also with the same reflection that we have to be okay with embracing the complexity of reporting, right? One, it's not going to be the magic bullet that fixes everything. And we see that also from CSR reporting, that it has to be more than a glossy publication exercise. And it's hard to get that right. We know that from the modern slavery reporting, that a lot of times the data is not, complete, and it doesn't really get to the heart of the matter. But on the other hand, having that information out allows us to analyze it. We can use it as a point of advocacy to see what the company has not done, what it should do. So I think it's a mixed picture, and we need to be okay with not having a magic solution, but to try all levers, including reporting, but it has to be good, better reporting.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Bonnie, for that.
Leila, should I briefly add on to that?
Please, Nora.
Just a quick comment. I think in terms of the CSRD requirements is also, it's asking after concrete evidence of, meaningful engagement with rights holders, with rights holders. So I think the more detail and transparency and the more understanding, a company covered by the law would have, and that is, in terms of our project, companies that are really starting to understand what is going on in their supply chains, and they're listening to the realities that workers are facing. This knowledge and this transparency and this insight into what's happening, and not shying away from actually understanding the impacts, will give them, we're only talking about a reporting framework here, but it will give them information and knowledge, and we may not like the knowledge and the information, but that's part of human rights due diligence and that reporting as well, to be able to speak about and to understand the issues. So in terms of the meaningful engagement and the practical activities taken in supply chains, projects like this can provide a lot more insight than any remote and kind of indirect and outsourced auditing processes, for example. It gives a lot more understanding and therefore control for the companies over the issues that are definitely happening in the supply chains.
That's good. Thank you so much. Well, maybe if he agrees, Chris, would you like to have the final word and remarks? I have a question. You report, but you report to who? As far as your organization is concerned, do you do also a lot of lobbying to, different states? So how do you do that?
Thanks. Yes, I'd be happy to. So we are an affiliate-led global trade union federation. So we have 700 unions around the world that represent 16.5 million workers in all transport sectors. Within that, we have 150,000 members of fishing unions in 90 different fishing unions, because in some parts of the world, the fishing industry is unionized, and obviously they result in much better working conditions, and they're not reliant on migrant workers because the jobs are well paid with a pension, and they have lots of young people entering the industry. You could take examples of Norway or Argentina or South Korea for that. So we don't interfere where there are national affiliates. We let our national trade unions do their work nationally. We get involved when our affiliates want support from us or when it relates to kind of the international sphere. The ITF is a social partner with the ILO and is also consulted by the International Maritime Organization. And we also work closely with the UN's FAO, which is the Food and Agricultural Organization, on issues around illegal fishing, because illegal fishing and forced labor tend to go together. If you're going to ignore one set of regulations, you're going to ignore the other. I mean, nobody's going to be catching endangered species and at the same time paying their work as well. Well, not generally. So yes, we work at that international level. We support our affiliates in country and we run regional projects. And in the UK, because none of our affiliates up until now organise migrant fishers, we've kind of taken the lead because there's a gap that needs to be filled. But part of that has involved actually working with our unions to figure out which one of them is best placed to actually run strategic organising campaigns for migrant workers. And we have a solution to that now. So hopefully the next time we meet, I'll be able to tell you some more details about that.
Right. That's good. That's excellent. We have something to hope for and something quite positive. So working with unions, and again, I can't, refrain from saying that, unfortunately, this is something, the patterns you've described are things that we see in many other sectors, having worked myself with many unions around the world in different sectors. Bonnie mentioned textile industry, for instance. You can mention the food industry and so on and so forth, and more technological industries these days. So solidarity is surely something extremely important. And I would like to conclude on these words in thanking you for your participation. That was absolutely excellent. I'm sure we all learned a lot and we'll be very much in touch to follow up and possibly start a few projects together. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much. I think it has been recorded with your authorization. We might post that to different, channels and so on, but we'll be in touch for that. So thanks very much and have a lovely end of afternoon, evening and night for Bonnie and Hawa in China.